Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast, The Human Side of Emergency Management. Today, in every fire landscape, whether it's in Canada, the snowy valleys of Australia, or closer to home for me, the rolling country around Cootamundra in New South Wales, culture shapes how we prepare, how we respond, and how we lead. Culture is the quiet architecture beneath every decision we make and implement. It is the stories we inherit from our families and our communities, the expectations placed on us, and the courage we choose to carry forward. An emergency management culture is not abstract. It is lived and it is felt, and it determines whether communities come through crisis fractured or strengthened. Today's guest understands that truth deeply. Jane Park, the prescribed fire training program out of the University of British Columbia, is with me today and works at the intersection of ecology, community, and human behaviour in one of the world's most iconic landscapes throughout Canada. Her work is not just about fire science. It is about people. It is about navigating the cultural weight of tourism, the expectations of a global audience, and the lived reality of communities who sit on the front line of climate-driven change. I saw this firsthand last October when Jane hosted us on country at Banff. She showed us a landscape that had been deliberately and carefully restored, a place where ecological health was returning and wildlife was finding its way back. It was a clear demonstration of cultural courage, scientific integrity, and leadership that swims against the norm. No small feat in a place watched by the world. Jane brings a perspective that resonates profoundly with the themes explored on the human side of emergency management. It's leadership under pressure, the emotional labour of public safety, the cultural forces that shape how women step into operational roles and stay in them. This is where her story connects powerfully with the Girls on Fire online in Canada. When we talk about culture, we're also talking about who gets to belong, who gets to lead, and who gets to be visible. Jane's presence in wildfire leadership is part of a broader movement that says young women do not need permission to step into fire. They need opportunity, mentorship, and a culture that recognises their strength. Her work, her voice, and her example help build that culture. They show girls and young women that fire leadership is not only possible, but it's also needed. So today, we are talking about the culture shift happening across fire agencies globally. We are talking about the future of leadership, and we are talking about the girls who will inherit that future, the ones already stepping forward through programs that Jane runs and that are ready to shape a sector that finally sees them. Welcome, Jane, to the Human Side of Emergency Management podcast. It's a pleasure.
Hi, good to be here.
Thank you. And I know you can tell it's quite cold here in Australia and it's quite warm there in Canada. Just want to start off briefly about when we went to Banff last year as part of the IAWF conference, the field trip. I was quite taken aback. It was such a visual experience. And then when we stood back and looked at the work that you were involved in there in terms of returning that cultural landscape back, it tested the norm in terms of looking at those mountains and that area, seeing it covered in all the trees, but you were actually returning back to its natural state where there are open plains on the side of the hills, where the animals could come in and soak up the sun, hunt for prey, feed on the grasses. And it was really quite overwhelming in terms of that learning that I felt. But how does that culture of place influence the way that you manage the fires in that cultural landscape?
I think when you're managing fire kind of in any landscape, it's kind of your own accountability to understand kind of the history of the place and the culture of the place. And, in many places in the world, fire was managed by Indigenous people for millennia, well prior to any colonization. And that's true in our parks in Canada and all over North America and even in Australia as well. And so understanding kind of what culture existed before the current kind of state of fire management is really important to understanding kind of what you're restoring things back to and kind of what the impacts have been of those changes in fire management. And so, I think, my learning kind of comes from a lot of the different experiences I've had, traveling around the world with fire and working in Arctic communities in Canada and learning from Indigenous people and living with Indigenous people and understanding kind of their connection to the land and what colonization did in terms of altering our landscapes has really shaped kind of how I interact with the land in my own practices. So in terms of, understanding that this carpet of lodgepole pine and dense forest in many places in Canada where there should be grasslands and more biodiverse habitat and interactions with Indigenous people, and that all of that changed with colonization and what impacts that had on biodiversity and fire behavior and fire risk to communities. Trying to incorporate that into the landscape in a good way, I think, is kind of our responsibility when we're in those positions.
Yeah, the thing I loved about when we're out there looking at the work that you're involved in, it's so right in your face, but it's so obvious. That I think that's the thing that struck me so much, is that it was just so obvious. That's the way it should be. And through that cultural burning and that prescribed fire, you actually are returning it back into that space. And it just felt right. And I think they were talking about they actually have released some bison back into the park in some of the areas, and they're actually going quite well. And yeah, I just found that really fascinating in terms of how natural, once the landscape was explained, I think from your perspective and how it should be. Yeah, to me, it just really made sense. And I think everyone that was on that field trip just almost took a step back and looked at it going, yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. And I do think we have to be careful there. We have a really long way to go in terms of a lot of things, in terms of reconciliation on, in terms of our relationship with Indigenous people and their ability to steward the land. And, even in Banff, we have done a lot of prescribed fire, but we are still working with nations in terms of restoring, cultural fire to the landscape. And, that practice is led by Indigenous people and is a cultural activity that has many different values associated with it. And it is gaining momentum in many places in Canada, and in many places it still has quite a ways to go. But I think in terms of, the intent and relationship building to try to get there, we've at least kind of started in a lot of these places. It's been many years of managing it in a very different way, in a more Western way, in a fire suppression focused way, and that sort of thing. So we can point at certain places as on the right track, to the right trajectory to some of these things. And to start changing people's perspectives. But, truth be told, like, the national parks in Canada are a very small portion of the landscape, and the scale at which fire needs to be restored on the land to make it more resilient, and the efforts that it will take to revitalize cultural fire and have that be a sustainable practice, and with funding for communities and to repair some of the impacts of colonialism on those practices, it will take a long time. But things are changing, just even the fact that I have a new job with a prescribed fire training program is a big change from, 24 years ago when I was on my first prescribed fire and very few people were doing it. So I think there's some hope on the horizon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know we're definitely going down that same path here in Australia. It warms your heart. I guess that you've talked a lot about that journey that you've been through. One of the things that's been very hard to develop is that trust in the prescribed burning program. And you've been doing this for many years. I just wanted to touch a little bit about how you develop that trust between communities and between the works that you're doing.
I mean, it's always a work in progress, and you always have to have your kind of pedal to the metal, so to speak. It doesn't come easy. It can be lost in a moment. Prescribed fire is a practice that takes a lot of care and planning. But it also is a practice that has some inherent risk. And, when you do prescribed fire, you can try to mitigate as much risk as possible through that planning process, and you can build trust through, open communication with the public and trying to inform them on what you're doing. But the truth is that fire is also a fairly scary natural process that brings a lot of fear. And, with the types of fire seasons we've been having and the type of fire behavior we're having, it is a difficult thing to communicate and to build that trust. And, the context and environment that we're working in is constantly changing too. So the fire behavior, the forests and the climate was different 24 years ago than what we're working with now. And so it's a kind of iterative process as you go.
We'll move on to Bolivia. I don't know much about your experience there.
Yeah, so a few years ago, I think it was in 2022, I'll fact check that for you, but I did a really weird thing. I was never on LinkedIn before, but for some reason I went on LinkedIn and I was maybe having maybe I was having a crummy day or something, but I decided to just set an alarm for any new opportunities on LinkedIn that might have wildfire or ecology something in the search. And I got this notification, and there was like an opportunity to work as a technical expert in fire management on what's called the Technical Assistance Program Expert Deployment Mechanism, I believe it's called, through Global Affairs Canada. So what it is foreign country governments can request technical assistance from Canada in whatever field that they require assistance in. And this particular project was a joint project from the National Park Service in Bolivia, the military, as well as the Department of Environment and Water. And they were trying to build additional wildfire management capacity in Bolivia because their fire seasons have also been getting more serious and more difficult. Yes. And so my role in that was to develop a training program to build capacity for fire management for the national park system. And then there was an additional Canadian expert, Mike May from Alberta, who was dealing with the military capacity side of things. And so, yeah, it's just an amazing opportunity to go to a place in the world that I've never been to kind of figure out kind of where they were at with fire management, where there were gaps in their own capacity, and then what types of training and expertise from Canada that we could kind of develop for them so that they could train more people to increase their capacity.
Yeah, I mean, going to Bolivia to work must have been a totally different culture. And, even just looking at how they run their resources, whether they have different resources, less resources, more resources, all of those questions would have been so broad, and it would have been an amazing opportunity for you to use that knowledge, because when we deal with ecology and prescribed burning and risk, the vegetation or that may change, but the principles are still the same. And the risk factors are still need to be identified and need to be mitigated. So I'm interested to see how that interaction went when you went to Bolivia to try and fit into that culture, coming armed with all this knowledge, but at the same time trying to tailor make it to a totally different country, language, and a knowledge base.
Yeah, it was a fairly daunting task, but it was really cool. We basically started with a needs assessment trip, basically. So I went down, I had made some connections with the National Park Service, and it is one of the most diverse countries that is totally landlocked and not very large, but it has everything from basically like the Amazon to high altitude mountains to deserts to wetlands. It's just extremely diverse despite being totally landlocked and not being very big. And so that trip, was, I can't remember, just under 2 weeks. I went down and I got to go to 3 different protected areas with vastly different ecologies. So I went to one area that was very high elevation, kind of desert, almost looked like chaparral, kind of that open scrub, lots of cacti and trees and desert, but it had recently burned. It's called El Palmar National Park, Integrated National Management Area. And it's where an endemic palm tree that only grows in that area grows at very high elevations, like 3,600 meters of elevation. And it had burnt recently, and they'd never in their oral history within their culture or in the management culture had ever experienced fire in that that type of vegetation. And so I got to go down and, hike at crazy high altitudes with very high heat for a Canadian in the middle of February. I thought I might die there, heat stroke, but I went with Indigenous park rangers who spoke their Indigenous language, and I had a Spanish interpreter, and they could speak Spanish too, thankfully, but the interpreter even had to say, just so you know, like when I'm not interpreting what they're saying, they're actually speaking in Quechua, not in Spanish. And so it was really amazing to spend time with folks and learn about their culture. And, when I asked them, like what happens to the palm trees when they've been burnt, and they're like, nobody's ever talked to us about, so not even elders. And so, going there, seeing this stand that had been burnt and trying to wrap my head around, like, if from my own kind of biases looking at the trees, I would have thought, okay, these small scrubby palm trees might have, been killed in the fire, and the bigger ones that have thicker trunks may have survived, but it's kind of opposite. And then just also, so learning about their culture, why that place was important, those palm trees have nuts that are really important cultural foods. And because they're only found in that area, it's obviously very important culturally. People hike, 15 kilometers into this park just to harvest those nuts. And there's a host of endangered species there, understanding that like there is no history of fire there. So, suppressing fire in that ecosystem was the better fire management tool. But then also realizing that the resources that they had, in Canada, 15 kilometers, if you have a helicopter, you're going to, there's water somewhere, you dump water on it, you can get some fire crews on it. But there, they have access, I think it was like single digits helicopters from the military, very difficult to get, untrained pilots. People were walking, they don't have a radio system. They don't have very many tools, and the bulk of the workforce are civilians who show up when the fire occurs, and then they go. And so, understanding the challenges that they have in terms of actioning that fire, and it being so vastly different to what we have in Canada, I really had to shift my mindset and kind of figure that out. And then we went to a couple other places, in the jungle and other near a community. And so I had to kind of absorb as much as I could from the culture, from their values, which were different. There was even some national parks where they did do prescribed fire. So it was a very wide range of capacity that was needed. And then I had to come back to Canada in the winter and, sit and try to develop a bit of a training program to help build capacity. And then kind of the final phase of it was to deliver that training to both the military and the National Park Service, and do some other kind of incident management training and try to build that overall capacity. Because what they were finding was that all the experienced people, there might be, 5 or 6 experienced park rangers, but they were spending all of their time making sure that the civilians, didn't injure themselves on these fires. So it was really difficult to actually manage. And so yeah, it was just an amazing experience. And I was very fortunate to be able to see so many different ecosystems in Bolivia, and really understand that, like, one size does not fit all. Even in a small country like Bolivia, you can't just say, oh, we're going to suppress it everywhere, because even there are fire adapted ecosystems that require fire. And so having the park rangers understand that each national park, it's a national park for a reason, and understanding the ecology there really should feed into how you manage fire there. And in some places it might be appropriate to have prescribed fire, in other places it might not. So yeah, it was a great learning experience. And I think, the more people get to travel around the world to be deployed to assist other countries with fires, I think the better kind of fire manager, practitioner, firefighter you are, because you can apply those principles, but in a different way. It kind of, like, I guess, works that fire brain.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to it, and all the conversations I'm having with people on the podcast about going into different cultures and that learning experience, and just even just a simple thing in terms of the resources. I mean, you can develop a U-Butte prescribed burning program, but you still need a structure behind that to be able to implement the program. And so it's, as you're saying, it's a really, really big system that you're sort of like stepping into. And I guess you're the sort of person that's trying to explain the risk and how to manage that risk. That must have been really challenging, especially with the language barrier on top of that as well. I just can't imagine how you do that. especially if they've not known fire before, because it could be scary. It could be, you know, people may not want to get involved, or you may get the absolute opposite. They just want to come in and control everything. It's a very challenging space to be in.
Yeah, and I think we held a number of train the trainer workshops. So we brought park rangers from kind of all over. Like we moved to, I believe, 3 different regions within Bolivia, and so park rangers from a bunch of the different parks would like come together for each workshop. And I think it really helped to have, some of the parks that like really had done some suppression, but kind of nothing else, and have people there from other parks that, actively do prescribed fire or have had more fires than some of the other parks, so that, you can learn off of everybody's lived experiences, and they could speak to each other in their own language about kind of the intricacies of what's different. But, I should say I had a very talented interpreter that was fully fluent in English and Spanish, who was with me pretty much the whole time, which really helped things. But the interesting part were there's a few moments where I actually didn't need him. And it wasn't because all of a sudden I developed some Spanish skills. I was really hoping that I would get really a lot better. But there were certain moments where there was like universal truths, I guess, that we could relate to. So one was, I was at a very remote park. I was at a park ranger station. There was this beautiful river. They'd caught fresh fish for us to eat. And they started explaining about how frustrated they were that, they could sometimes get aircraft from the military, but the pilots were not used to firefighting. And so they started showing me videos on their cell phones, and they were showing me videos of really ineffective bucketing by helicopters. And despite the fact that they couldn't speak English and I couldn't speak Spanish, as soon as they showed me the videos, we all started kind of laughing, because I said, that happens in Canada too. Sometimes we get, drop the water from way too high up, and there's nothing that hits the fire. And so we had a good laugh about that. And then there was another moment too where I was kind of looking at the landscape, and it was this kind of open, again, like kind of high plains grasslands, but then there were strange kind of plantations of pine, and they pointed at some pine that looked very like native to that area, and they said, oh, these are endangered pine trees. And then when I kind of asked the species, they started talking about different species. And as soon as we started talking about different pine species, I didn't actually need my translator, because I could tell that they were talking about native pines, and then they were talking about these non-native European pines that have been planted all over. And my interpreter's like, how come you can why are you understanding what they're saying now? I'm like, well, because they're speaking about like vegetation and I can understand what they're saying. So it is interesting that despite language barriers, there are these like common threads that you can kind of, riff on with each other.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And that to have that opportunity, and to I guess the exciting thing about being a part of that is you're actually giving them their own information for them to actually learn and grow. You're igniting it almost like a spark in terms of their knowledge. And I get moving away from that, they're going to keep going because they're so invested in their community and their culture and their environment that, it would have been an amazing program to be involved with. I just want to sort of just take a little bit of a slight shift. I just want to talk a little bit about the work that you do with Girls on Fire. I know we have a very different program here in Australia. You also do have a social network in Canada. It's something that I'm quite passionate about as well, in terms of empowering women to, feel that they can take up leadership roles, be involved in prescribed burning, whatever the role that they need to be in. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the role that you play in terms of starting that, because I know when I was in Canada, we had that Girls on Fire function one evening, and the conversations just blossom and they bloom and they just grow. And I think if it hadn't have been from that session, we may not even be having this conversation today, because you just have that opportunity to connect. I just wanted to touch a little bit about that in terms of what it means to you, and and having follow through from, dealing with other women around the world, in your own community, in different cultures and all that sort of thing, because it's something that's so important. And I know my background, your background, the work that we do, it's, you can't be what you can't see. And I just feel that's such a critical thing to have role models. And I think you're absolutely outstanding in that space, Jane, because you have so many multiple roles, but you're so connected to culture and community, and in a space where there's not many women.
Yeah, it's kind of like when I think about, 24 years ago when I kind of first even started to dabble a little bit in this. Yeah, there were no, I think I worked with one other woman who still is around and works for Alberta. But yeah, there were no women, and it kind of, I guess it wasn't something I actively thought about, maybe because there was nobody else to talk to about it. But it started to dawn on me driving back from a fire one day where I had a person I was driving with, and she had a lot of fire experience, probably more, varied operational fire experience than I did even at that time. At that time, I was a operations section chief on a deployment, and we were driving back, and, she had just mentioned that she had never really seen a female operations section chief before, and it just didn't dawn on her that that was a career path that was open to her. And it kind of surprised me because this person is extremely strong, capable, competent, had leadership skills, and would be an amazing, probably a better ops chief than I was. And so it kind of made me really reflect on the fact that there are people that if they don't see themselves reflected, they won't just go for it. Like maybe I'm just kind of naive and dumb and just keep going without thinking about it. But it just struck me that, maybe I have a responsibility to try to make sure that there's not people that are just discounting themselves. And so that was kind of my first kind of light bulb in my head moment to think like, well, that's really sad that there's a barrier there. Anyways, I don't even know how many years beyond that, but I had a number of women on the fire crew in Banff, and where I was living was very close to where they were doing some fuel mitigation work in the winter. And the one day it was just all the women that were working for some reason. I don't know if the other crew was sick. I can't remember why, but I just said, why don't you come over for coffee? I'm on the way down, so just have your coffee break at my house instead of going into town. And I started a little backyard campfire. We're sitting there, and we started talking about just like our experiences as women. In Canada, it is growing. There's a larger number of women on crews and in leadership roles, but it's still, on the big fires, it's still only probably 10% or 20% at the maximum. And so, as you do, you kind of commiserate about, the different things that we experience, whether it's, people not, expecting that we're leaders. And so talking to the men that we're leading instead of us if we're crew leaders, or just nobody taking us seriously, or the challenges in terms of being an outspoken woman or thinking that we're not physically capable and those kinds of things. And we started talking about leadership, and I forget what book it was, but one of the women said, oh, there's this book and you should read it. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. We just kept talking, and I thought, it'd be really cool if like you met my other friend who's also a woman in fire. And so I just like on a whim started a Facebook group, and I called it Girls on Fire because for a while there was like myself, my fire management officer, who's actually Erin Giselle. She runs the aviation program for Western Australia, and another friend of mine who's now with the Yukon government. And we used to just joke that we were the Girls on Fire. And so I just named the Facebook group that, not thinking it would turn into anything. And it was like 6 people to begin with. But, having gone to Australia and all over Canada and stuff like that, it did what social networking is supposed to do, I suppose. And it just started connecting all of these women who had no other forum to chat about and ask, what pants fit me, or, what kind of boots come in like the smallest sizes. And, what do you do about that time of the month on fires, or how do I get into this career or whatever. And it grew, and I can't remember what the current total is, but it's like 800 people now across the world, and it's really cool. And I'm a little like daunted by the fact that I started this thing, and I'm not really, don't know how to really curate what it is, but it seems to have a life of its own. And as you said, like we held that event in Calgary, and I met more women across Canada and the world. I met you, and it's doing what it's meant to do. And
yes,
Yeah, I think, I was on a fire about 5 years ago in southern BC, and we were fortunate to get 100 firefighters from Mexico. And within that 100 firefighters, I believe there were five women, if I'm correct. Maybe there was 10, but might have been 10, might have been five. Very small number of women out of 100. And it was really cool because my incident management team actually had a large number of women on it, several section chiefs, quite a few of the support roles. And we decided we'd do a photo of the like 20 women that were on the fire because there were so many. And I spoke to the Mexican women, and they said, it was so hard for them to get on that deployment. They had to fight and have other, some of their male mentors really kind of advocate for them to be able to go because they weren't going to be allowed to go. And then they said, they finally were given the permission to go, and they just thought it was so amazing to show up on a fire. And the incident commander was a woman, that was me. And then to see all these women in leadership positions, and it just validated their struggle to try to get there. And so, the whole thing is kind of taking a life of its own. It's not something I like intended to be some crusader for, people of color or women or, people that just aren't represented, but it's kind of turned into a bit of a side quest in my career, I guess.
Sometimes that they're the best networks because everyone that's there wants to be there, because it's grown organically. And that's the one thing I love about working with women is that connection. And because there's stuff that we experience that, most other people don't. And it's really interesting. I mean, I'm going to do a whole podcast one day about all the things that have been said to me about being a woman on the fireground. But yeah, it is so critically important, and it's so important that as you said, that younger women especially have role models and can see that they can do it, and it's not as scary as it looks. It's a profession, and it's a job which you train to do, and you develop your skills as you grow. And that's the one thing I love. I'm sort of at that stage in my life where that's where I want to be, is like to provide those skills and provide other women with opportunities. And I have had the opportunity to be involved in one of the Girls on Fires program here in Canberra, actually. And I just literally had to take a couple of steps back and watch the young women, because that they were over it. They had it in the bag. They were not holding back. And I'm just going, yes, I wish I had been like that 40 years ago, but it's definitely growing, and I think we have to keep that momentum going, as you mentioned, and we have to keep pushing. But I guess my perspective, I do it a lot in Australia, but there's a whole world out there, and I think what you're saying about the Mexican women is so critical, that we embrace and try and support them as much as we possibly can. Because it gives you a start, doesn't it? As I was saying before, it lays that seed, or it lets that seed blossom, and it'll just keep on growing.
Yeah. And I think if you have people who come from, underrepresented groups in these kinds of professions, then it should open the doors for other people, like a lot of what I talk about is around like my gender, but like I am a immigrant, a child of immigrants. I'm obviously Korean. And if you talk about the percentages of non-white people in fire, it is very low. I always get excited if I see another, Korean name on the manifest, if I'm going somewhere. But I think like having been kind of on that side of being underrepresented and having the intersection of being like a Korean woman, because, I've faced a heck of a lot of racism in my career as well. It definitely helps, I think, to be a leader that has empathy for those parts of the population that we're trying to serve that, have differential treatment or are facing like increased impacts. The Indigenous communities in Canada are facing many more impacts from climate emergencies and climate change than the rest of Canada. And I've had both the fortune of working with a lot of communities really closely, and I've really struggled sometimes to feel like I'm doing my best when there are systems that kind of consistently continue to like oppress communities that we're trying to help. And so I think having leaders that have some of that experience of, being the underdog or experiencing the discrimination or having to kind of fight for every step of the way gives you a bit of an eye on the lack of privilege that certain parts of the population have, and how you manage fires in those areas and how you interact with those communities can be made better by your own experiences if you can kind of have that empathy and put yourself in their shoes a little easier, for better or for worse.
No, absolutely. How do you think we create a fire culture where women feel like that they truly belong? Is there something that we can do better? I know we're talking about inclusion, and for me, I think it's about sharing knowledge, sharing experiences, and sharing our stories, so people can understand that they're a part of that story and a part of that journey as well. But is there something that we can actually do for women to make sure that they do feel like they belong?
Yeah, I mean, I think like male allies and just allies in general play a huge role in terms of creating a safe space for people. When I was an incident commander on a team that largely we had probably three-quarters men, 100% white other than me, three-quarters men. There were times that my ops section chief really was a huge ally. Like, we'd be in meetings and people would constantly defer to him, and he would literally say, I don't know why you keep looking at me. She's the incident commander. And, because like, as much as I have experience and I have confidence in things like that, it's uncomfortable when that's happening to you in that type of professional space sometimes. And also you get exhausted. And, I know on that deployment, there was a few racist things that happened, a few other things that happened. And you don't want to always have to stick up for yourself. And so having strong allies across the board and having folks that will kind of, have your back is super important to creating that culture. And I think I'm not necessarily somebody who thinks that, we need extra coddling to make us, have different positions or whatever. But I think that as you change people's perspectives, and it becomes less and less tolerated to be ignorant about people's experiences, you create a place where you're out of the norm if you're not accepting that anybody can do these jobs. So, in my own program, when I worked in Banff, I didn't intentionally, I didn't have some sort of quota system where I said, I'm going to have one of each kind of person. I just created a culture where people knew they were safe if they worked for me, and they knew that I'd stand up for them regardless of what their background is. And, by the time I left to take some other opportunities, I had, multiple members of the LGBTQIA plus community. I had Indigenous colleagues. I had, people with disabilities. I had all sorts of different people, and we were all different and brought all sorts of things to the table. And I think that's what made our program good. But, I think some people would say oh, it's just because you're like this champion for DEI and you made sure that you checked all the boxes. It was not intentional like that. I chose great people for their skills and what they brought to the table. And because it was safe, those people applied. And it wasn't that I intentionally didn't hire the majority. And I had lots of, guys that fit the stereotypical mold as well, but they also were supportive of that culture too. So I think that, sometimes you have to be a bit heavy-handed with culture if it's really not working. But I think also if you as a leader just create a space where people can feel comfortable being themselves and expressing themselves whichever way they show up, it'll just happen because people will want to be there and you'll create a thing.
Yeah, it's so interesting. The two careers that I've literally worked in is firefighting and emergency management. The other career, because we're on farm, so I deal in the agricultural sector, and both of them are male-dominated environments, and both of them are very different experiences being female, and it's taught me a lot over the years. And same sort of thing. Quite a few years ago, I was looking at buying a small farm, and I took my partner along, Robert, who's a fifth generation farmer, for his eyes to critical analysis as well. And the guy kept on addressing him, and Robert's doing the same thing. Vivian's the purchaser, not me. And he must have told him 4 or 5 times to speak to me, not him, to the point he ended up walking away because he just wouldn't deal with me direct. Anyway, in the end, we decided we'd never work with that company ever again. So, and actually lost business because of it. I just never forget that. It was such a clear example of really struggling trying to deal with someone that was culturally different to them. Yeah, that was quite a few years ago. The one thing that I sort of want to touch on briefly is everything that we've discussed, whether it's culture, community, trust, leadership, DI, the whole kit and caboodle. What kind of leadership do you think that we need in fire agencies moving into the next decade? Because I know you've now transitioned into a different role. So when you sort of move out of that space that you did for so long, you can actually sometimes look back and see things with clarity. And I'm just wondering if you've experienced that when you moved out of that national parks area, moving to the University of British Columbia. And do you think there's something there that they need to develop in the next decade in terms of their leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the changes in like the fire season and climate and just socially, I think leaders have to be more, I don't know, flexible, plastic to the changing dynamic. And, you can't take what worked 24 years ago and apply it to today.
Yeah.
We can't, I think in some cases we can't even take what happened 5 years ago and apply it to some things that are happening today. And so I think I kind of was like waxing poetic the other day, just, reading all sorts of social media and things about people complaining about our smoke and things. And I'm, while I totally wholeheartedly believe in like the whole of society approach that everybody talks about, like we need to put our money where our mouth is. I don't know. I'm really bad at saying, but we need to really stand behind what that actually means and realize that that is not doubling down on suppression. It means that we really have to think of new ways of tackling some of this stuff. We need to think at a scale that, when we're talking about prescribed fire, especially in Canada, where our ecosystems are not like a lot of places that do a lot of prescribed fire, where the fire regime is very frequent kind of small to medium-sized fires. Like the boreal forest is humongous, and it is a stand replacing large mixed fire severity regime. And so the scale at which some of the actions we have to take is very big now, because we've had such a gap in forest management, bit of just suppressing everything. And so you add the suppression on top of the climate change, and you've got this kind of perfect combination of things. And so I think leadership has to really start to think out of the box and look for leadership in different places and, give power to groups that maybe have not traditionally held power in terms of Indigenous stewardship of fire. It's very clear that no one agency, even if you mush them all together and make a national one, no one agency has what it takes to fix everything by itself. And so figuring out, there's a big piece of pie, who gets which piece of pie, and we all have to do it together, because like no one thing is going to do all of it. And so I think just to be nimble and really, like you say, take a step back and like be really self-reflective about your role and how that might have to differ from what you're used to.
It's interesting listening to your discussion. It's a beautiful segue into my next question. So I was going to ask you, how's climate change changing the expectations that's placed on us as fire practitioners?
Yeah, I mean, I think the people on the front lines, the firefighters, the incident management teams, we're very acutely aware how it's changing. It used to be, 10, 15 years ago, you'd get deployed once or twice out of your jurisdiction. Now it's several times. Now we're going around the world. Things are burning at night. Things are burning, in Canada, our spread distances are 50 kilometers instead of 10, and it's burning in the darkness. We had a fire run in October when there should be snow in the mountains. It grew overnight because our RHs were single digits in high elevation where there should be snow. I think on the front lines, we're very acutely aware of the impacts, the burnout, the mental health, the lack of capacity and resources. I think, though, the expectations of the public, of the policymakers, of the media, that's stayed the same. They think, for the last 100 years, you've got 99% of the fires. What the heck's happening now? Well, it's like this cumulative impact of all these things. And, we're not winning, but the expectations are staying the same. And so it can be, I found, the last several years as an incident commander and even watching the current fire season and the rhetoric in the news and with the politicians and things, it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating because I know being that everybody is trying their best to work within a system that was built around conditions that we're not seeing or that we haven't seen before. And so, the system was built, for conditions that are kind of obsolete now. And so, I just think that it is a difficult space to work in right now. And there's quite a bit that needs to change in terms of policy and priorities and valuing of different worldviews and cultures and perspectives and leadership that kind of needs to happen so that we kind of change that trajectory.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's interesting. When I was having a conversation with someone the other day about, looking at expanding their business to other countries rather than just Australia. And I was trying to explain to him that when you go into all these different countries and all these different cultures, the expectations are sort of still the same as what you're saying. They still expect you or the government or the whoever the responsible authority is to come and put that fire out. They want to be safe and they want to be protected. That doesn't change, but everything else around us is changing. And as you rightly pointed out, it's changing so fast. I mean, I know, and I've said this a few times in the podcast, some of the big fires I've been to over the last few years, the worst fire conditions were in the middle of the night. And that was unheard of 5 years ago. So we were preparing to fight really high intensity fires at 1 o'clock in the morning. And I don't know. I think I'm probably glad I'm sort of getting to the end of my firefighting career rather than just starting, because the game has changed and it's radically changed and the rules are changing.
I think leaders have to, like I said, have to be nimble and flexible, but also there has to be a, good dose of humility there too. I had a very difficult fire season. Well, 2020, every season is difficult, but 2023 was particularly difficult. And there was a very, very large wind and extreme fire event that had been forecasted for quite a long time on a fire I was the incident commander for. And, they're talking about 100-kilometer winds, and we had already had, extreme fire behavior. So the thought of 100-kilometer winds on top of what we had with communities in the way. I remember distinctly having a conversation with, we're just about to go into unified command with some other agencies. And we had a really difficult conversation about when do we just get out of the way, because the right thing to do is just make sure nobody dies in front of those flames. Because the thought of what the fire behavior could be was beyond aircraft, beyond, what's an aircraft going to do with 100-kilometer winds and spread rates of crazy and whatever. And we made the decision to evacuate the community and to let the community and the agencies know that, this was we had to stand aside while this thing happened and hope that we had everybody safe and that we got the public out safely. And we had to see how it played out, and then we could go back in afterwards. And it was difficult. I mean, maybe it's good, maybe it's whatever, it's slightly embarrassing, but I cried on the call when I had to tell the community that we were stepping back, because, any fire person wants to do right by the communities that you're serving, and it's not hard to see what the impacts are for communities when you have to evacuate, or if they lose structures, or in some cases this year entire communities are gone, which is just horrible, and you obviously don't want that to happen. But
yeah,
you also are responsible for the people that work for you. And so making those decisions is agonizing. And, the unfortunate part is that we're having to make those decisions more and more. And in the current social climate, everybody's looking for someone to blame. But really, like, the blame is on, hundreds of years of different kinds of management. It's legislation, it's colonialism, it's climate change, it's all these things. And, the people on the front line, maybe you've been in fire for 20 years. Like, no matter what you did in 20 years, like, what's happening now can't be pointed at a single person. And, having worked with so many different agencies, it's very clear that, all the people that work on these fires are really trying to do their best.
Yeah. It's interesting. I hear the same thing from everyone around the world, and we're getting all the footage of what's happening in Europe at the moment, what's happening in Canada. And I'm sure there's a lot of countries that don't even come across our radar that are experiencing, the effects of climate change as well. But I also have a saying that I've used for many years, that fire doesn't discriminate. It just follows its path. It follows its fuel. It follows the wind and what's put in front of it. But a firefighter, I've never known a firefighter that ever goes to work to do a bad job. And, when someone's on the odd occasion when someone tries to criticize what we have or have not done, that is what my go-to. To this day, 40 years, I've never known anyone that's turned up on the fire ground to do a bad job, because it's just not an option.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Jane. I usually have a signature question that I ask everyone at the end of the program, and I'm not prepared today. I don't have it here. Isn't that terrible of me? I'm so busy racing around today. But basically, I look at the heart of what we do, and I generally ask, at the end of the day, what is it about your leadership, your experience, that keeps you coming back time after time? What is it about you that helps you keep coming back to do the job that you do?
I mean, I think it is the human. It really is the people. I think fundamentally, I just want to contribute to help people. So, even in the past week, I've had people reach out that are, dealing with wildfires affecting communities and reaching out for various kinds of help. And I just think that I just want to, serve the people that I can in whatever way I can. And so it's just about figuring out where I'm needed and trying to kind of find that path. And it doesn't always mean that I'm leading it. Sometimes it means that I'm following somebody else's lead, or just even like propping up and trying to help other people lead. I'm in the international mentorship program, working with a young woman from the U.S. Forest Service. And, it's just rewarding to know that I'm contributing in some small way. It's not, it may or may not be life-changing, but it's whatever I can do. So I think that keeps it meaningful for me, and kind of drives me to keep wanting to, like, meet new people and connect the dots whichever way I can.
And that's partly why I started this podcast, is because I just meet so many brilliant humans around the world, and the work that everyone does is just so important, but it's also heartfelt. And I'm loving that you've got this new role, working in the prescribed fire training programs with the University of British Columbia, because I can see you absolutely growing in that space and contributing so much to everyone that's, that you'll be working with.
Yeah, it's kind of rewarding, like, after many years of kind of feeling like so much of fire management was focused on suppression, and, 20 years ago or whatever, 15 years ago, talking about prescribed fire, certain agencies or in certain forums, like nobody really cared. Everybody was about suppression. And, starting with this program and starting to talk to different people across the country and seeing that shift. There, like a culture shift is happening, like the amount of support and different large wildfire agencies, like almost all of them want in on it. They're all seeing it as a tool in the toolbox now. And that wasn't necessarily the case even like 15 years ago. So it is kind of a nice, maybe it's a bookend to my career. I'm hoping to retire soon, but yeah, it's kind of a nice place to land, I think.
Yeah, I know, that's fantastic. Thank you, Jane. I really appreciate you being a part of the podcast today. And say hello to your dog.
It's really trying to make his way onto the podcast.
That's quite all right. I've actually hosted quite a few dogs on the podcast.
Of the dog side of emergency management.
Well, that's right. It's part of our human side, isn't it? Dogs are a major part of some of the work that we do at times, especially search and rescue and stuff. Yeah. No, thank you. I really appreciate you giving your time, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you.
Yeah. Thanks, Vivian.